Let's continue working on our very small shoe article project in this coding challenge number 2. So just like before, use the results of the previous challenge as the starting point for this one. And if for some reason you don't have that code, then as always, I have the starter and the final code links somewhere in this lecture. But it would be better, of course, if you would use your own code, maybe if you have it on CodePen, or if you're doing this challenge on your own computer using VS Code. All right. So we ended up with this result in the last coding challenge. So remember, it was this. And what I want you to do now is to use your new knowledge about the box model to arrive at this result. So you see that this article here, so this element is a lot more narrow now, and it is also nicely centered in the page. So the width of this container here, so this article element, is 825 pixels. Next, you can see that many margins and paddings have been removed, and so that probably means that there has been some global reset here. So do that just like we did in one of the lectures. But then, of course, keep adding back some paddings and some margins. So whenever you see some space here in this example, for example, here inside of this heading, then of course you need to add back some space. And you can do that using margin or padding, as you know. So just choose the right one for the right situation or according to what you learned. Finally, another thing is that this button here now is really wide. So it spans all the way from the left side to the right side. And also it now has this border here at the top, so to create this illusion of a button even when we're hovering it. So see if you can maybe arrive at this result, but if you can't, then that's of course, as always, not a big problem. So just take some time now and really try to code up this challenge, and I see you back here when you are done. Okay, so let's waste no time and start right away. And I will actually start, to give us some more space here. So I will start with that global reset I mentioned. So adding a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 to every single element on the page. All right, and now I will actually make this product here, so this element, I will give it the width of 825 pixels as I had mentioned before. All right, and so now it's time to center this in the browser. And in the last lecture, I actually showed you how to do that. So there we created an element that we called the container, and then we centered that inside of the body. Now in this case, the container is basically this product here, right? And so that is where we add the width, and so that's where we also set now the left and right margins to auto. So I'm using the shorthand here and giving it at the top and the bottom 0, and then left and right auto. And so here we go. Now it is centered inside of the body. Beautiful. But we can actually make this a bit better because now it's kind of glued to the top here and the same down here. So instead of having top and bottom at 0, let's set them to 50 pixels. And so that then creates some space basically around this element. So we added 50 here, down here, and 50 here at the top. Great. Next, let's add some space back here in the heading. So that is the product title. And so now we want some space inside of the element so that we can create some empty space here, which still has some background color, right? So that's why we use padding, because we want that space to be inside of the element and not outside of it. So if it was a margin, then it would look like this. And then the background color would, of course, not be anywhere here. So because it's outside, right? We want it inside, and so then that's padding. All right. So that's starting to look a lot better. Now maybe let's create some space here between this shipping and this text. And so for creating some vertical space, I am again using margin bottom. So here in shipping, let's add some margin bottom of, let's say, 20 pixels. Yeah, that looks a lot better. And let's take a look at the final result that we want to achieve. And so you see we have some space here as well. We also have some space below this heading here. And then this unordered list also moved back here inside of the container. Because notice that right now these bullets are outside, right? And so let's now fix all of that. So let's start with this one here and giving it 15 pixels. And as always, if your numbers here were different, then that doesn't matter at all. All right. And now some space here between this link and this title, so this heading. And the logical thing to do would probably be to add some margin bottom to the link. Because as I said, the best thing to do is to stick to one of the directions, so to one of the sides, and then always add the margin there. So let's try that. So it's this more info link, but you will see that this will actually not work. So you see we added it and it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is something that I will explain in the next lecture. All right. So what matters now is that this doesn't work because you basically cannot use margins on small elements like anchors, so like this link. And so instead, what we will do now is to add a margin to the top of this element. And so this will then visually look exactly the same way, right? So adding 30 to the bottom of this looks essentially the same as adding 30 to the top of this one. Next, let's then fix these bullet points that are outside of our container element. So margin left, let's say 20 pixels. Yeah, so that looks nice. And now I want to add some space here also between these elements. So that is this details list right here. And so let's select each of these elements that are in there. So dot details list, and then all the li child elements. So this right here is a descendant selector, just like we have learned previously and as we have used many times before. I think we have never used it where one of them is a class selector like this and the other is an element, but of course that's no problem. We can just combine them in any way that we want. And so let's now add that space, let's say some 10 pixels. And now finally, to finish, let's work a little bit here on this button. So this one. And I'm going to start with some padding here. So adding some space inside of the button. So that already looks a lot nicer, right? But now let's have it go from one side all the way to the other side. So that's something very similar as we did with the image in one of the previous lectures. So we can simply give it a width of 100%. And so now it basically occupies the entire parent element, which is, of course, this complete article element. And now all that we are missing is that border at the top, right? So remember that here in our demo, when we hover it, then it still kind of looks like a button, right? And in order to create that effect, so that kind of illusion, we need this border here at the top of the button. So let's add that. And so it is basically the same border as goes around this article. So let's see what we have there. And we can actually go ahead and copy it. The only thing that we need to then change is that we only want this border at the top in this case. Okay, and now there we go. So beautiful. That works just nice. And I think with this we actually finished this challenge. So it looks just like our demo here. So I think we're done here with this challenge. So great job, well done, and congratulations for writing a lot of code on your own once again. So these are really, really important for you to consolidate your knowledge. So I'm very happy to see that you're still with me here at this point, because that's really the box model down. Let's go one step further and talk about different types of boxes that exist in the box model. And maybe you had already noticed that there are different types of boxes in CSS. So let's inspect this element here to show you what I mean. So this one, for example, and you see that this H2 element occupies all the space that it can occupy. So basically it goes all the way from the left side to the right side, right? And the same is true, for example, for this entire header, of course, for this entire article, and the header as well. And really, most of the elements are like this, but then there are also other elements, so other boxes, so to say, like this one. So here we have this strong element, but you see that it only occupies exactly the space where its content actually is. And the same thing is true, for example, for this image here. So you see it's only really 50 by 50 pixels, which is exactly the size of the content itself. And for example, the same thing here with this anchor tag, which again, you will now see that it occupies exactly the width that is needed for its content. So these types of boxes that only occupy exactly the space that they need for its content is what we call inline boxes. And on the other hand, all these other boxes, so for example, this paragraph or this H3 heading, these we call block level boxes or block level elements. So block level elements or boxes occupy all the space that they can, and they basically create line breaks after them. Or in other words, they cannot be side by side with one another, right? So of course, if they take up all the space they need horizontally, then of course they cannot be side by side. That makes sense, right? So these are the fundamental differences between block level boxes and inline boxes. But there are some more, so let's take a look at a comparison. So here I highlighted all of the block level elements or block level boxes that are on our page right now. And as I already mentioned, these elements are basically formatted as blocks. So big blocks of content which occupies 100% of the parent element's width. And that is true even if the content itself wouldn't actually require so much space. For example, this "What is HTML" heading actually wouldn't need the entire line, right? But it is still a block level element because then they can be stacked vertically one after another by default. Now, one thing that is very important to mention is that the box model applies exactly as I showed you before to block level elements, while the same is not true for inline elements, as we will see in a second. Okay? Now, by default, most of the HTML elements are actually block level elements. So things like the body, main, header, and so on and so forth. So most of the elements really that we used are block level elements. So we can also say that they create block level boxes. All right. Now, one thing that we can do with CSS is to change from inline boxes to block level boxes. And we can do that with the display property set to the value of block. But we will do that in practice in a second. But for now, what I want to do is to look at the inline element and how it's different from block level elements. So here I marked the inline elements with this red border, and you see that, as expected, they only occupy exactly the space that is needed for its content. They also don't create any line breaks after or before the element, and so therefore they can simply stay inside of their parent elements without creating any additional space. And this is exactly what makes sense for smaller elements like the strong element, the EM element, or anchor elements, right? We wouldn't want these elements to create a new line and occupy all the width that they can. That just wouldn't make any sense, and therefore that's why we have these different types of boxes. But anyway, now about the box model. As I said, it works differently in inline elements. So for inline elements, the height and width properties do not have any effect. Also, paddings and margins are only applied horizontally, or in other words, on the left and right sides, but not on the top and bottom. And this fundamental difference about how the box model works for inline elements is extremely important to always keep in mind and to never forget, because this is a mistake that I see beginners make all the times, which is basically to not understand why certain properties of the box model do not work as expected when applied to inline elements. So take note of this, as it is very important to always keep in mind. Now, by default, some of the elements that are inline elements, so which create inline boxes, are the anchor, image, strong, EM, the button as well, and many more. Now, just like we can use the display property to make any element a block level element, we can also use display set to inline in order to transform any block level element to an inline element. And actually, let's now go back to our code to see some of these things in action. And let's start by trying to format these links here that are in the header. So let's select them, but I will do that more down. So let me actually create some comments here. So let's say that these are like page sections or something like that. So basically all the big dividing pieces of our page. So we have the body, of course, the container, the main header, the navigation, article, and all of that. And then here is where we start to have our like smaller elements. And these titles here don't really matter. I just want to have like a visual separation inside of the code. Okay, so let's go down here, all the way down. Maybe let's say here. And so I want to select all the links that are inside of the navigation. So let's say navigation and then the links in there. And as always, I should use the link pseudo class to actually style them. Now to see this a little bit better, what happens? Let's give them a color, a background color, like orange red. And now I need to manually reload here. Okay, so we got that background color. And now let's start by adding some margin here, just so we see that the box model does in fact not apply the way that we thought it would. So let's say 20 pixels and give it a save. And you see that some margin was added horizontally, so on the left and right side, right? But what did not happen was that vertical space was created. So the top and bottom margins remained unchanged. Now, if we check this out here in the box model in the DevTools, then it will still appear down here. Wait, some more space here. So you see that the 20 value does still appear, but then here on the colored overlay, so here this orange, actually did not create any space, even though it says 20 here, right? And so as you know by now, the reason for that is that the anchor element is an inline element where the box model does not create any vertical space. And the same is true for padding. So padding of 20 pixels. So let's see. And now it does actually look as if some space was created. But that is only true for inside of the element. Because in fact, the anchor content, so the anchor content itself is still in the exact same place. But if this was a block level element, then all of this would have moved down a little bit. So basically the fill area of this element has been expanded and filled with the background color, but no new space was in fact created. Okay? But if we actually want to have that space, and if we want the elements to be one after another, then of course we can change them to block level elements. So that is exactly what I showed you in the slide by using the display property and set it to the value of block. And so this will then render the inline element as a block level element. So what do you think will happen once I save this now? And there we go. Now all of these elements occupy all the width that they can, and also they have now actually also vertical margins between them. Now they are kind of outside of this header element now, because we set the header element to a fixed height. So in one of the previous lectures. So let me show that to you with the overlay. So we need some more space here. And so since we set the height to the header to a specific value of 80 pixels, then the content no longer fits in there. And so the element did not expand in order to fit the content. So that's the reason why usually we don't set a fixed height on elements. So let me go back and change that. So that was just a demo anyway. So yeah, here is the height that we set to 80. So let me comment that out, save it again. And now the element expanded vertically here to account for the additional space that is required. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. But the main point here is that these anchor elements here now do satisfy all the conditions of being a block level element. So the box model applies to them normally, and they occupy 100% of the available width, and so therefore they appear one after another nicely formatted as blocks. All right, so they occupy all the space as we see here, which of course includes the margin. So each of these, if we take a look, has some margin, right? So that is this kind of orange color here. And so that is part of the entire space that the element itself requires. All right, but let's go back down here and actually turn all of this off, because this was really just a demo. Okay, and now of course we will see the header shrink back to only occupy vertically here the space that it needs. Right, so as we keep adding more and more elements, then this should grow, which is exactly what happened before when these links were bigger. But now they're back to being small, and therefore all that space we had was not required. And now next, let's actually quickly try the opposite and change some block level elements to inline elements. So for example, let's try what happens when we make the list elements as inline. Display inline. Let's remove this actually. And now you see that these three elements are now basically side by side and occupy only the space that they need. And actually, let's bring this back, because as I mentioned, the dev tools are really so important, especially for overlaying like these boxes, right? So now the boxes are side by side like this because they are inline boxes. So they no longer create the line breaks after them and only occupy the space that they need. Let's try the same. I'll turn it off here and try the same on the paragraphs. And so that looks even stranger because all the text basically collapsed just into one big line of text, it looks like, right? So again, each of these elements now basically only occupies the space that it needs. All right, but let's remove this because it doesn't make much sense in this situation, but in some situations it actually makes a lot of sense. Now, in many situations, what makes even more sense is to transform a block level element into something called an inline block element. So basically, that's a mix of inline and block level. So let's quickly check out what that means. So here we have a quick summary of both the block level and the inline boxes. So we already know that, so we don't need to go over all that again. But then there's basically a third type of box, which is a mix between these two. And so that is, as I said before, the inline block box. So inline block boxes, they look like inlines from the outside, but they behave like block level elements on the inside. So what that means is that inline block boxes do only occupy the space that they need for the content, and so therefore they do not cause any line breaks. So this is what I mean when I say that the inline block box behaves like an inline box from the outside. However, as I said, it behaves like a block level box on the inside. And so what that means is that the box model applies just as it does for block level boxes. So we can still set heights and width, and we can still use margins and paddings just like on block level boxes or on block level elements. So these are kind of the same, so I keep using them interchangeably. So essentially, inline block boxes really combines the best of both worlds of block level and inline. And in order to create an inline block element, all we have to do is to set the display property to inline block. And that's it. And so let's now see how we do that in practice and some situations where this can be extremely helpful. So let's go back here to our header links. So to this navigation, so that I can show you where an inline block element can be very helpful. So right now there is not a lot of formatting here, so like no spacing. So we need to fix that. So this was somewhere down here, right here. And so let's go back to trying to add some margins without changing anything in the display property for now. So let's say we wanted a margin right of 30 pixels, and this should work because it is a horizontal space, and so that works even on inline elements. But now if I wanted to add a margin top of, let's say, 10 pixels, then nothing will change, right? So it stayed the same, and so that's exactly the behavior that we saw already at the beginning. But now, if we change the display to inline block, then see what happens. So you saw that now we got our space here. And if we check this out, then indeed, you can see that orange space on the right side and then the 10 pixels on the top. So the box model is back to being applied as a block level element, but on the outside, the elements are still side by side and occupying only the space they need. So behaving like inline elements. So this is a great technique in some situations, even though at this point we also have more modern ways of doing something similar. But in some cases, this will actually be very good to know and a good technique to have in your tool belt. Now just one final detail is that we should remove that margin right from the last element. So let's select that, nav a link, and now you will see something new. So this here is a pseudo class, right? But onto that we can chain another pseudo class, because now we want the last child, right? Like this, and then we want to set the margin right back to 0. Okay, so visually that changes nothing, but here we now see that this one no longer has that space on the right side. And many times that's important to do, and so that's why I wanted to show you that we can chain these two pseudo classes like this without any problem. Great! And now, just to finish, I wanted to show you that images are actually inline block boxes. Alright, so I said in the beginning that images are actually inline elements, but in fact they do behave like inline block elements. And we can easily demonstrate this by adding some margin, for example, to this post image here. So if I add a margin of 100 pixels here, then if it was an inline element, it should not create any vertical space. So not here and not here, right? But watch what happens as I save this. And so indeed, you see that all of this vertical space here was added. And so that is proof that indeed it is an inline block element. And the same is true for the fact that we can set width and heights for this element. So if it was a purely inline element, then these two here would also not work, right? So that's also important to note. And let's just set it back to normal here. Okay, so that's it for the type of boxes in CSS. Just as a quick summary, or basically as a takeaway from this lecture, most of the time we will actually leave the display setting alone and simply use the predefined box type, because by default they do actually make a lot of sense. However, we can use display set to block in order to make a small inline element, for example, occupy an entire line, which is something that we will sometimes need in the real world. Then the other way around, sometimes we don't want a block level element to push all the other elements into a new line. So basically we don't always want them to occupy all the available blank space that there is to fill. And so in that case, we can set them to an inline element, or probably even more useful, we can set them to an inline block element, because then we can still apply the box model